Mr. Whitmore, if your father knew people were going to lose their homes, why did he hide the checks? Naomi's tiny hand pressed the old cassette player against the polished boardroom table. The tape inside clicked once, loud enough to cut through the silence. Ethan Whitmore froze beside the floor-to-ceiling windows while the city lights trembled behind him like shaken gold. Across the room, Claire Bennett slowly lowered her glass of water, and for the first time all night, her perfect smile disappeared. Then the cassette began to play a man's voice nobody in that room was supposed to hear anymore. And somehow all of it traced back to 11 rainy days earlier. Naomi Brooks hated the sound the pipes made at night. Every time the heat kicked on inside apartment 3B, the old metal walls groaned like somebody trying not to cry. She sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor beside her grandmother's tiny stove, turning a screwdriver inside a broken cassette player while tomato soup simmered nearby in a dented pot. Outside the window, Chicago rain streaked down the brick buildings of Brookside homes. "Still dead?" Martha asked gently from the sink. Naomi tapped the side of the cassette player twice. "Not dead," she whispered. "Just tired." Her grandmother smiled at that, but only for a second. Then the smile faded as another envelope slid beneath their apartment door. Naomi looked up immediately. Martha didn't move right away. That was the first strange thing. Usually she grabbed the mail before Naomi could even see it. This time she stared at the envelope like it had teeth. Finally, she picked it up and folded it face down on the counter beside the unpaid electric bill. Naomi noticed the gold seal in the corner before it disappeared beneath Martha's hand. Whitmore Holdings. The same company logo hanging on the giant billboard across the street beside the words "Future Starts Here." Naomi hated that billboard. The smiling families on it never looked anything like the people in Brookside. Martha turned back toward the stove too quickly. "Soup's ready, baby." But Naomi was still watching the envelope. "Is that another moving letter?" she asked quietly. Martha didn't answer. First, the radiator hissed. Somewhere upstairs, a baby started crying. "It's grown-up business," Martha finally said. "Nothing for you to carry." Naomi lowered her eyes to the cassette player. Adults always said that right before something bad happened. She slid the batteries back inside and pressed play again. Static crackled through the tiny speaker. Then, for half a second, soft jazz floated into the kitchen before dying again. Naomi smiled anyway. "See?" she whispered proudly. "It still remembers." Martha looked at her then, really looked at her, and something painful flickered across her face. "Your mama used to say that too." Naomi rarely heard her grandmother mention her mother out loud. Before she could ask another question, headlights flashed across the wet apartment walls from outside. A long black SUV rolled slowly past Brookside for the second time that night. Naomi stood up and moved toward the window. The SUV stopped beneath the Whitmore billboard. Its dark windows reflected the rain like mirrors. "Grandma," Naomi said softly, pressing her fingers against the cold glass. "Why would rich people keep watching us if they already decided we don't matter?" The next morning, Naomi sat on the front steps of Brookside Homes, tightening the loose lace on her left sneaker with a bent paper clip. The rain had stopped, but the concrete still smelled wet and cold. Across the street, the giant Whitmore Holdings billboard flickered once before returning to its bright promise of luxury apartments and rooftop gardens. Naomi stared at the smiling family printed on it. None of them looked worried about overdue rent notices. Behind her, Martha locked the apartment door carefully, checking it twice before slipping the key into her coat pocket. That was unusual too. She usually hummed while getting ready for work. Today she was quiet enough that Naomi could hear the distant rumble of the train 2 blocks away. "You waiting for somebody?" Martha asked softly. Naomi shrugged. "That black SUV came back 3 times last night." Martha stopped halfway down the stairs. For one brief second, real fear crossed her face before she buried it beneath a tired smile. "Rich people get lost too, baby." Naomi looked down at the paper clip twisting in her fingers. "Not 3 times." Martha opened her mouth to answer, but headlights swept across the street again. The same black SUV rolled slowly past Brookside. This time it didn't keep going. It stopped beside the curb. Naomi felt her stomach tighten as a man stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat darkened by mist. Ethan Whitmore looked different outside the glowing magazine photos. Taller somehow. More tired. He glanced at the building, then at the folded eviction notice still sticking halfway from Martha's purse. Martha instinctively tucked it deeper inside. Ethan noticed anyway. "Ms. Brooks," he said carefully. "I'd like a moment if that's all right." Martha folded her arms. "Folks like you usually buy moments from people like us." Ethan accepted that without argument. Naomi watched him closely. Most rich men she'd seen on television talked fast. Like silence made them uncomfortable. Ethan didn't. He stood there with cold wind tugging at his coat while traffic hissed along the wet street behind him. Finally he crouched slightly so he could look Naomi in the eye instead of over her head. "You were watching my hotel yesterday," he said gently. Naomi shook her head. "No, sir. I was watching the lady beside you." Something shifted in Ethan's expression. Tiny but real. Martha stepped in quickly. "Naomi notices things she shouldn't sometimes." "Maybe," Ethan said quietly, still looking at Naomi. "She notices things everybody else ignores." The words hung between them longer than anyone expected. Then Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded copy of the Brookside contract. Naomi immediately spotted the gold tabs along the edge. Her fingers tightened around the paper clip. "Those weren't there before," she whispered. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're sure?" Naomi nodded without hesitation. "Yesterday the pages had red ones. And—" She stopped. Ethan leaned closer. "And what?" Naomi pointed toward the bottom corner of the document where a tiny blue sticker clung near the binding. Barely visible. Almost hidden. "Why does a housing contract have a hospital label on it?" Ethan looked down sharply at the paper in his hand while, across the street, the black SUV's driver quietly lifted a phone to his ear. The hospital sticker had been peeled off once before. Ethan noticed it only after Naomi pointed at the corner of the contract. A faint rectangle of older glue sat beneath the blue label like something had been covered, removed, then covered again. Most people would never have seen it. Naomi did. The black SUV pulled away from the curb before Ethan could look toward the driver again. Tires hissed across the wet street, disappearing into morning traffic. Martha's shoulders loosened slightly, but Naomi kept staring after the vehicle long after it vanished. "You know that sticker?" Ethan asked carefully. Naomi shook her head. "No, sir. But my mama used to bring papers home from the hospital with those colors on them." The sentence landed strangely. Martha lowered her eyes so quickly it felt practiced. Ethan noticed that too. Somewhere nearby, a basketball bounced against cracked pavement, while an ambulance siren echoed faintly downtown. Life kept moving around Brookside as if nothing dangerous had stepped onto the sidewalk at all. Ethan unfolded the contract again. The blue sticker carried tiny printed numbers beneath the edge. Not legal formatting. Inventory formatting. "Daniel," Ethan said quietly into his phone a moment later. "Run a trace on document code HN204. Naomi watched his expression shift as he listened. The billionaire who had arrived polished and controlled now looked distracted in a way powerful men rarely allowed themselves to appear. Daniel's voice crackled through the speaker. "That code doesn't belong to Whitmore Holdings." Ethan frowned. "Then where is it from?" A pause. Keyboard clicks. Then Daniel spoke again, slower this time. "St. Helena Medical Archive." Martha went completely still beside the apartment stairs. Naomi heard her grandmother's breath catch before Ethan did. "That hospital closed years ago," Martha said too quickly. Ethan looked up at her. "You know it. Everybody around here knew it." Martha adjusted the sleeve of her coat, but her fingers trembled slightly. "A lot of people lost jobs when it shut down." Naomi tilted her head. "You worked there." Martha's eyes widened just enough to betray her. Ethan saw it immediately, another piece sliding out of place. Before anyone could speak again, Ethan's phone buzzed. Claire Bennett. Her name glowed bright against the dark screen. Ethan declined the call without thinking. 3 seconds later she called again. Naomi noticed his jaw tighten before he answered. Claire's smooth voice carried faintly through the speaker. Ethan, the board moved the signing to this afternoon. Reporters are already asking questions. Ethan glanced down at the contract in his hand. Why is there a hospital archive sticker on legal paperwork? Silence. Tiny. Brief. But real. Then Claire laughed softly. Probably recycled print stock. You know how legal departments are. Naomi looked toward the billboard across the street again. Wind rattled the metal frame hard enough to make the smiling printed family shiver. That lady lies fast, she whispered before she realized Ethan could hear her. Another silence followed. He should have corrected her. Instead, he found himself staring at the contract longer than the answer deserved. Then Daniel's voice suddenly returned through Ethan's other phone line. Urgent this time. Ethan, I pulled the old St. Helena records. Papers shuffled loudly in the background. You need to see who signed the hospital closure documents in 2008. Ethan's face hardened. Who? But Daniel didn't answer right away. And somewhere above them, in apartment 3B, Naomi's broken cassette player suddenly clicked on by itself for one brief second. Rich people always ask questions after the bad thing already happened? Naomi asked as Ethan opened the passenger door of his black sedan for her grandmother. The question stopped him halfway through the motion. Cold wind moved between the apartment buildings, carrying the smell of rain and traffic exhaust from the avenue beyond Brookside. Martha hesitated near the curb. Naomi. Baby, Mr. Whitmore's trying to help. Naomi climbed into the back seat beside her cassette player without answering. Ethan shut the door more carefully than necessary. During the drive downtown, nobody spoke. For several blocks, the city slid past in gray reflections across the windows. Laundromats, corner stores, church signs glowing faintly in the damp afternoon light. Ethan kept replaying Daniel's unfinished sentence in his head. You need to see who signed the hospital closure documents in 2008. But Daniel had never actually said the name. At a red light near Michigan Avenue, Naomi suddenly leaned forward between the seats. Why do your buildings all smell the same? Ethan glanced at her through the mirror. What? Your hotels too. She pointed toward the leather dashboard. Like lemons and cold air. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. There are companies people hire for that. Naomi nodded slowly, as if confirming something important. Brookside smells like soup and wet socks. Martha let out the faintest laugh under her breath. The sound surprised all three of them. Then Ethan's phone buzzed again. Claire. He ignored it this time. Another buzz followed almost instantly. Then another. Naomi watched the screen light up repeatedly in the dim car. She really wants you to sign those papers, she murmured. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. A lot of money depends on this deal. Naomi tilted her head. Does money get scared? The question hit harder than it should have. Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but traffic lurched forward before he found one. A few minutes later, they pulled into the underground garage beneath Whitmore Tower. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. As Ethan stepped out, Naomi stayed frozen inside the car staring at the concrete pillars. You okay? He asked gently. She pointed toward a silver security camera turning slowly above them. That one's broken. Ethan glanced up automatically. The tiny red recording light was off. How can you tell? Naomi shrugged. It keeps looking at the wall instead of people. Ethan felt something cold move quietly through his chest. On the elevator ride upstairs, Martha stood unusually close to Naomi, while Ethan scrolled through documents on his phone. The restored St. Helena files had finally arrived from Daniel. Hundreds of scanned pages. Financial transfers. Closure agreements. Employee lists. One page caught Ethan's eye immediately. He zoomed in slowly. St. Helena Medical Archive. Property Transition Authorization. Signed by Charles Whitmore. And beneath his father's signature sat another name Ethan recognized instantly. Claire Bennett. The elevator doors opened into the executive floor before he could process it. Staff members moved quickly through the polished hallways carrying tablets and coffee trays, pretending not to stare at Naomi's scuffed sneakers or Martha's worn coat. Naomi noticed anyway. She stepped closer to Ethan without seeming embarrassed by it. Then, just before they reached his office, she stopped walking altogether. Ethan turned back. "What is it?" Naomi stared toward the frosted glass doors at the end of the hallway, where Claire stood speaking quietly with a man Ethan didn't recognize. The man handed Claire a thick envelope. She slipped it into her purse fast when she noticed the elevator doors open. Naomi's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "That's the same envelope Grandma got this morning." The envelope slipped halfway out of Claire Bennett's purse as she turned toward her office. For less than a second, Ethan saw the red stamp across the front. Final relocation notice. Martha saw it too. Naomi reacted first. "That's ours," she blurted before anyone could stop her. Claire's polished smile froze just slightly at the edges. The hallway around them stayed busy with assistants, elevator chimes, ringing office phones, but suddenly Ethan heard none of it. Claire recovered quickly, smoothing one hand over the envelope. "Brookside paperwork," she said lightly. "Nothing alarming." Naomi stared at her. "Then why'd you hide it?" Martha inhaled sharply beside her granddaughter. Ethan noticed the way several nearby employees immediately pretended not to listen. Claire stepped closer, heels soft against the marble floor. "You must be Naomi." Her voice sounded warm enough for anyone else to trust. "Your grandmother's spoken very highly of you." Martha's posture tightened instantly. "No, I haven't." Another tiny crack. Another thing that didn't fit. Claire's smile faded for half a heartbeat before returning smoother than before. "Of course," she corrected. Softly. "I meant your building manager." Naomi looked down at Claire's purse instead of her face. "You keep saying the wrong things," she whispered. Ethan felt the temperature in the hallway shift. Claire turned toward him. "Ethan, the board meeting starts in 20 minutes. Why are relocation notices already printed if the deal isn't approved?" he asked quietly. Claire didn't answer immediately. That frightened him more than if she had argued. Finally, she gave a small sigh. "Because delays cost millions of dollars. Preparation isn't conspiracy." Ethan held out his hand. "Let me see the envelope." Around them, conversations slowed. A receptionist nearly dropped a stack of folders while pretending not to stare. Claire's fingers tightened around the purse strap. Then Naomi suddenly stepped forward and tugged Ethan's sleeve. Small movement, easy to miss, but it stopped him from reaching the envelope too quickly. "Sir," she murmured carefully. The corners ripped. Ethan looked closer. The envelope seal had already been opened once and glued shut again. Claire noticed his eyes land on it. For the first time since he'd met her years ago, she looked cornered. Not angry, cornered. "You're letting a child turn this into theater," she said softly, but there was steel underneath now. Ethan slowly took the envelope from her hand anyway. Inside sat 6 relocation notices addressed to Brookside residents. Dates already stamped. Move-out deadlines already assigned. One notice carried Martha Brooks' full name. Another stopped Ethan cold. Lillian Brooks. Naomi noticed his expression immediately. "That's my mama." The hallway fell silent enough to hear the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Martha grabbed Naomi's shoulder too fast. "Baby, no." Ethan stared at the paper. "I thought your mother passed away years ago." Naomi blinked up at him, confused by the question itself. "She did." Martha closed her eyes briefly like someone bracing for impact. Claire reached carefully for the envelope again. "Those records are old, Ethan. Brookside has outdated tenant files all the time." But Ethan wasn't looking at Claire anymore. He was staring at the relocation date printed beside. Lillian Brooks' name, October 14th. 6 months after her reported death. Naomi suddenly pulled the old cassette player tighter against her chest. "Grandma," she whispered slowly. "Why would they send moving papers to somebody who wasn't alive anymore?" Before Martha could answer, Ethan's phone buzzed violently in his pocket. Daniel's name flashed across the screen beside 3 words that made Ethan's blood turn cold. "Do not trust Claire." The executive lounge outside the boardroom felt strangely quiet after the hallway confrontation. Rain tapped softly against the tall glass windows overlooking downtown Chicago, while muted voices drifted from behind closed conference doors. Ethan stood alone near the coffee station, Daniel's warning still glowing on his phone screen. Do not trust Claire. He read the words again anyway, slower this time, like repetition might somehow change them. Across the room, Naomi sat cross-legged in one of the oversized leather chairs, turning the loose knob on her cassette player back and forth without pressing play. Martha watched her granddaughter carefully but said nothing. That silence worried Ethan more than panic would have. Most people rushed to fill silence when they were scared. Martha guarded it. Ethan loosened his tie slightly. Daniel doesn't scare easily, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Naomi looked up. Maybe he got scared because he finally saw something. Ethan glanced toward her. What do you mean? Naomi shrugged. People ignore weird things when they see them every day. The answer settled somewhere deeper than he expected. Ethan looked down at the relocation notice again. Lillian Brooks, dead 6 months before the document date. Yet somebody inside Whitmore Holdings had kept her active in the system long afterward. He tried to tell himself it was sloppy paperwork. But sloppy paperwork did not usually arrive inside hidden envelopes carried by nervous lawyers. Near the snack counter, an assistant replaced a tray of bottled water with fresh ones. Naomi watched the woman carefully. Everybody here walks fast, she whispered, like they're late even when they're standing still. Martha almost smiled at that. Ethan didn't, because now he noticed it too. The building carried a kind of polished urgency that suddenly felt less impressive and more afraid. His phone buzzed once more. This time it was not Claire. A known number. Ethan answered cautiously. Static crackled first. Then Daniel's voice, low and rushed. I can't stay on long. Somebody accessed the archive after I pulled the St. Helena files. Ethan straightened immediately. Where are you? Doesn't matter. Listen to me. Claire signed more than closure papers in 2008. The line crackled harder. Somewhere in the background, a train horn echoed faintly. There's another ledger tied to Brookside. Charles Whitmore hit it after. The call cut dead. Ethan stared at the silent phone. Naomi stopped turning the cassette knob. That sounded like the train station near 14th Street, she said softly. Ethan blinked. How would you know that? The horn's broken, she replied. It squeaks before it gets loud. Martha shifted uneasily beside her. Ethan suddenly realized Naomi had been listening more carefully than any adult in the room all day. Not spying, not scheming, simply noticing. He moved toward the windows overlooking the city below. Far beneath them, traffic crawled through wet streets like rivers of red and white light. For years Ethan had believed control meant seeing everything first. Yet somehow an 8-year-old girl kept pointing toward the exact places he had stopped looking. Behind him, Naomi quietly walked toward the side table, holding old architectural display models of Whitmore projects. Her fingers hovered over one labeled St. Helena Redevelopment, 2008. This one's wrong, she murmured. Ethan turned. Naomi pointed at the miniature building beside the hospital tower. That daycare shouldn't be there. Martha went pale instantly. Ethan frowned. Why not? Naomi touched the tiny plastic rooftop gently, almost sadly. Because Grandma said the daycare burned down before the hospital closed. The room fell still again. Then, from inside Claire Bennett's office across the hall, came the sudden sound of shredders starting all at once. The shredders stopped the moment Ethan stepped toward Claire Bennett's office. Too sudden, too clean. The executive hallway fell into a strange silence broken only by the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Naomi noticed it first. Machines don't stop that fast unless somebody gets scared, she whispered. Ethan pushed open Claire's office door without knocking. Warm amber lighting spilled across polished bookshelves and framed awards. Claire stood calmly beside her desk holding a glass of sparkling water while 2 assistants quietly stacked empty shred bins near the wall. Nothing looked rushed anymore. That made it worse. Something wrong? Claire asked with perfect composure. Ethan's eyes moved immediately to the shred bins. Thin strips of white paper curled inside like snow. What were you destroying? Old financial drafts. Claire took a small sip of water. The board prefers clean files before acquisition votes. Naomi lingered near the doorway beside Martha. Her gaze drifted toward a bronze picture frame sitting half-hidden behind a lamp on Claire's shelf. The frame held an old photograph of St. Helena Hospital before renovation. Naomi narrowed her eyes slowly. That playground, she murmured. Claire stiffened almost invisibly. Ethan caught it this time. What about it? He asked. Naomi stepped closer to the shelf before Martha could stop her. It didn't burn down. The room changed temperature again. One assistant accidentally dropped a handful of shredded paper strips onto the carpet. Claire set her water glass down too carefully. Excuse me? Naomi pointed at the tiny playground in the photo. Grandma told me the daycare burned. But that slide's brand new there. Ethan looked harder at the picture. Fresh paint. Bright equipment. No fire damage at all. Martha suddenly moved forward. Naomi, enough. Too fast. Too nervous. Ethan turned toward her. You said the daycare burned before the hospital closed. Martha's voice lowered. That's what people were told. Another shift. Another crack opening beneath the story everyone had accepted for years. Claire folded her hands calmly, but Ethan noticed her thumb pressing hard against her ring finger beneath the desk. A habit. Pressure point. St. Helena closed after several accidents, Claire said carefully. Old records get messy. Naomi stared at the photograph instead of Claire. Then why does everybody remember the same fire if there wasn't one? No one answered immediately. Outside the office windows, gray clouds rolled lower over downtown Chicago until the city looked submerged beneath stormlight. Ethan suddenly understood something that unsettled him more than the hidden contracts or relocation notices. Somebody had not simply hidden information. Somebody had built an entirely different memory around Brookside and St. Helena. His phone buzzed again. Daniel. This time only a text arrived. Check the childcare payments. Before Ethan could respond, Claire stepped around her desk smoothly. Ethan. May I speak with you privately? Naomi looked up instantly at the change in Claire's voice. Softer now. Almost careful. Ethan noticed it too. Why? Claire hesitated a fraction too long. Because this situation is becoming unfair to your board. Naomi quietly moved closer to the shred bin while the adult spoke. Her fingers brushed one curled strip of paper near the top. Just one. She glanced down at it casually, then froze. Numbers. Dates. Partial name. Lillian B. Naomi's eyes widened before she could hide it. One of Claire's assistants noticed immediately. Hey! Martha grabbed Naomi's shoulder at the exact same moment Claire turned around sharply. But Ethan had already seen Naomi clutching the paper strip tightly against her sweater. And before anyone could stop her, Naomi looked directly at Ethan and whispered, Mr. Whitmore, why would my mama's name be inside papers they were trying to destroy? Claire's assistant lunged for the paper strip in Naomi's hand before anyone else moved. The motion was quick enough to startle Martha, but Naomi reacted first, stepping backward so fast the cassette player banged against her knee. Ethan caught the assistant's wrist halfway through the grab. Don't touch her, he said sharply. The room went still. Real still this time. Not polite corporate silence. Fear. Claire recovered first. Everyone needs to calm down, she said softly, though a pulse now flickered visibly in her neck. Naomi clutched the paper strip tighter. Tiny black letters trembled beneath her fingers. Lillian Brooks. Childcare transfer account. She didn't fully understand the words, but she understood the adults' faces around them. Adults only looked like that when something dangerous became real. Ethan slowly released the assistant's wrist without taking his eyes off Claire. Why is Lillian Brooks connected to childcare payments? Claire's expression hardened for the first time since he had known her. Because Brookside residents received assistance programs through St. Helena. Then why shred it? Ethan asked. Claire didn't answer immediately. Outside the office, Movement suddenly erupted in the hallway. Fast footsteps. Raised voices. Daniel Reeves appeared at the glass doors looking pale and breathless. His tie half loosened like he had run upstairs. "Ethan," he said urgently. The board moved the vote up. 10 minutes. Ethan frowned. "What?" Richard Hale called an emergency session. "They're trying to force the signing before legal review finishes." Another shift. Bigger this time. Naomi felt it immediately even if she didn't understand all the words. Something was slipping out of Ethan's control. Daniel noticed Naomi holding the paper strip. His face changed instantly. "Where did you get that?" Before Naomi could answer, Claire stepped forward smoothly. "From stolen company property, apparently." Martha moved protectively closer to Naomi. "She picked it out of your shred bin." Claire ignored her completely. "Ethan, if this child keeps interfering with confidential material, I'll have security escort them both out." Naomi looked up sharply at the word escort. Not because she was afraid of guards. Because Claire had looked relieved when she said it. Ethan noticed too. Another tiny thing that didn't fit. "No one's touching them," he said flatly. Claire's calm cracked for just a second. "You are risking a $480 million acquisition because an 8-year-old keeps making guesses." Naomi spoke before Ethan could. "I'm not guessing." Claire turned toward her slowly. "Then tell me, Naomi, what exactly do you think you found?" Martha squeezed Naomi's shoulder, gently warning her without words. But Naomi kept staring at Claire's desk instead. At the bronze picture frame beside the lamp. At the hospital playground frozen inside the photograph. "The daycare wasn't closed," Naomi whispered. "It was moved." Silence swallowed the office again. Daniel blinked hard. Ethan stared at Naomi. Even Claire looked caught off guard for half a heartbeat. Naomi pointed carefully toward the shredded paper strips scattered near the trash bin. Those papers said transfer account, not closing account. Ethan felt something cold settle deep inside him. Not destruction. Relocation. Somebody had moved children connected to St. Helena Records somewhere else. Before anyone could speak again, Daniel's phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He checked the screen and all the color drained from his face. "Ethan," his voice nearly failed him. "You need to see this right now." He turned the phone around slowly. A security alert flashed across the display in bright red letters. St. Helena Archive storage accessed. Files removed 8 minutes ago. Beneath the warning sat one more line. Authorized by C. Bennett. Naomi looked toward Claire instinctively. But Claire was no longer looking at them. She was staring at the office doorway behind Ethan like she had just realized someone else was standing there. The man standing behind Ethan wore a gray maintenance jacket and carried a cardboard archive box against his chest. Nothing about him looked important until Claire Bennett saw him. Then all the color disappeared from her face. "You weren't supposed to come here," she said before she could stop herself. The room froze around the sentence. Ethan turned slowly toward the man. Mid-50s. Thin shoulders. Nervous eyes. The kind of face people stopped noticing 5 seconds after meeting. Yet Claire looked genuinely afraid of him. The man swallowed hard and shifted the box awkwardly in his arms. Security downstairs said Mr. Whitmore needed the St. Helena transfer files signed personally. Ethan frowned immediately. "I never requested that." Daniel stepped closer. "Neither did I." Naomi noticed something nobody else did. The man's hands were trembling so badly. The papers inside the box rattled softly together. Not the shaking of guilt. The shaking of someone terrified of being seen. Claire moved first. "Give me the box, Walter." Walter. The name landed strangely in Martha's expression. Her eyes widened before she lowered them fast. Naomi caught that too. "You know him," she whispered. Martha stayed silent. Too silent. Walter looked toward Martha instead of Claire. "I didn't know the child was here," he murmured quietly. Ethan felt the floor of the story shift beneath him. Not because of the sentence itself. Because Walter had said the child. Like Naomi mattered to whatever this was. Claire stepped forward sharply. "Walter, enough." But Naomi had already moved closer to the box. One corner had split open slightly. Inside sat dozens of old manila folders marked with blue hospital stickers identical to the one on the contract. Naomi gently touched the nearest folder before anyone stopped her. Brookside Child Transfers, 2008. Her small fingers froze. Child transfers. Not relocation payments. Not housing records. Children. Ethan looked at the label, then slowly at Claire. The entire story he had been building in his head suddenly cracked apart. This was never only about apartments or real estate deals. Something else had been buried inside Brookside from the beginning. Walter looked exhausted now, like carrying the box had taken years instead of minutes. "I told her we should have destroyed these after the fire story," he whispered. The words hit the room like shattered glass. Martha covered her mouth instantly. Daniel stared at Walter in disbelief. Claire closed her eyes briefly, the way people do right before losing control. Naomi looked confused more than frightened. "There wasn't a fire," she said softly. Walter's eyes filled with immediate regret. Too late. Ethan stepped toward him slowly. "What do you mean, fire story?" Walter glanced toward Claire instinctively, like he had spent years waiting for permission to speak. Claire's voice turned cold. "Don't." But Walter looked at Naomi instead. Maybe because she was the only person in the room still seeing him as human. "The daycare never burned down," he admitted. Quietly, the children were moved out overnight before anyone asked questions. Another piece fell violently into place. The false fire, the transfer accounts, the erased records, the hidden childcare files. Naomi's mother connected to all of it somehow. Ethan suddenly understood why Claire had panicked over a little girl noticing paperwork. Naomi hadn't interrupted a business deal. She had stumbled into something people had spent 14 years trying to bury. Then Naomi tilted her head slightly at Walter. "If the children got moved," she asked carefully, "where did they move them to?" Walter's mouth opened, but before he could answer, every light in Claire's office shut off at once. Darkness swallowed the room. A second later, somewhere deep inside Whitmore Tower, the emergency alarms began to scream. Before the emergency lights fully stopped flashing, Ethan Whitmore grabbed the archive box out of Walter's shaking hands and carried it himself into the dark hallway. Not an assistant. Not security. Him. The red alarm lights pulsed across the marble floor while employees hurried toward elevators in confusion. But Ethan didn't slow down once. "Daniel," he said sharply, "lock every digital file connected to St. Helena and Brookside. Nobody deletes anything else." The command came out differently than before. Cleaner. Harder. Like a man finally choosing a side even before he understood the whole war. Naomi hurried beside him, clutching the cassette player against her sweater, while Martha stayed close behind. Claire stepped out of the darkened office last, perfectly composed again despite the alarms. "Ethan, you are overreacting to incomplete records." Ethan stopped walking so abruptly that Daniel nearly collided with him. "Children were moved in secret," Ethan said quietly. "That stopped being incomplete a long time ago." For the first time, Claire looked genuinely uncertain about him. The group moved quickly through a private corridor toward Ethan's executive conference room, while emergency generators hummed alive overhead. Half the tower remained dim except for strips of backup lighting glowing along the floor. Naomi noticed something strange immediately. The farther they walked from Claire's office, the more relaxed Walter became. His hands still trembled, but not the same way. Less fear. More exhaustion. "He thinks she can't hear him now," Naomi whispered softly to Martha. Ethan heard her anyway. Another observation no adult had caught. Inside the conference room, Ethan locked the door himself. Rain hammered harder against the windows now, turning downtown Chicago into blurred rivers of silver light. Walter carefully placed several old folders across the table. Most carried blue hospital stickers. One carried a faded yellow stripe instead. Naomi noticed it instantly. "That one's different." Walter looked startled. "You've got sharp eyes." Naomi pointed at the yellow stripe carefully. "The others say Brookside. That one doesn't." Ethan pulled the folder closer. "Childcare Transfer Site B." Temporary holding. No address. No company letterhead. Just dates and signatures. One signature froze him immediately. Charles Whitmore. His father. Ethan sat down slowly. 4 years he had defended Charles in every interview, every business article, every charity gala speech. But the man inside these documents felt unfamiliar now. Not evil. Worse. Complicated. Daniel flipped through several pages rapidly. These transfer logs stop suddenly after October 2008. Walter nodded faintly. That's when people started asking questions. Naomi stepped closer to the table before anyone noticed her reaching toward one of the pages. A child's drawing had been clipped beside the records with an old rusted paperclip. Crayon stick figures beneath a hospital sun. One figure wore a blue necklace colored carefully darker than the rest. Naomi touched the drawing lightly. My mama used to draw necklaces like that. Martha went pale instantly. Ethan looked up sharply. What necklace? Martha hesitated too long. Walter quietly lowered his eyes. Another silence filled the room, but this one carried memory inside it. Naomi frowned at the drawing. Grandma said Mama lost hers before I was born. Walter suddenly whispered something so quietly Ethan almost missed it. No, he said. She didn't. Every head turned toward him. Walter swallowed hard, staring at the child's drawing like it hurt to look at it after all these years. Then Daniel's laptop chimed loudly from across the table. He looked down at the screen and all the color drained from his face again. Ethan, he said carefully. Someone just accessed the Whitmore private family archives from inside this building. Ethan frowned. Who? Daniel turned the laptop slowly around. The access authorization blinking across the screen carried only 2 words. Charles Whitmore. Naomi was the first person to notice the clock in Ethan's conference room had stopped. Not slowed. Stopped completely at 8:14. The second hand trembled in tiny broken movements without moving forward. That's weird, she murmured, setting the cassette player carefully on the table. Ethan barely looked up from Daniel's laptop. What is? Naomi pointed toward the clock. It keeps trying to move. Walter's face changed instantly. Not fear this time. Recognition. Ethan caught it out of the corner of his eye. You've seen that look before, he said quietly. Walter lowered himself slowly into a chair like his knees suddenly hurt. Charles Whitmore used to stop every meeting at exactly 8:14. The room stilled. Rain tapped against the windows while backup generators hummed softly somewhere deep inside the tower. Ethan frowned. Why? Walter stared at the stopped clock for several seconds before answering. Because that's when the buses left St. Helena. Naomi looked confused. Buses? Daniel's fingers froze above the keyboard. Ethan felt something tightening beneath the surface of the story again. Walter rubbed one trembling hand across his mouth. People thought Brookside children were moved after the daycare fire. His voice sounded tired now, stripped of whatever fear had kept him silent before. But the buses left before any fire was reported. Another crack. Another assumption collapsing. Ethan leaned forward slowly. You're saying the fire story came afterward? Walter nodded once. To explain why nobody could find the children anymore. Silence hit harder this time because nobody in the room wanted the next piece. Naomi quietly reached toward the old folder marked Transfer Site B again. She flipped one page herself before Ethan could stop her. Small fingerprints, heights, ages, medical notes. Then one line circled in faded blue ink. Special clearance. Family authorized. Naomi tilted her head. This says somebody's family said yes. Ethan took the paper from her gently. His eyes locked onto the authorization signature beneath the line. Charles Whitmore. Everything inside him shifted violently. Until now, Ethan had believed his father might have discovered the truth too late. Maybe covered things up afterward out of shame. Maybe tried fixing it quietly. But this signature came before the transfers. Before the fake fire. Before the missing records. His father had known from the beginning. Worse than known. Approved. Martha sat down slowly beside Naomi like the strength had left her legs. Daniel looked physically sick. Why would Charles Whitmore move children in secret? Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Naomi with a sadness that felt older than the room itself. Because some of the children weren't supposed to stay connected to Brookside anymore. Naomi frowned. Connected how? Walter opened his mouth carefully, but Ethan suddenly interrupted. Wait! Something else had finally clicked into place. The relocation notices, the erased tenant files, the childcare transfer accounts. Lillian Brooks staying active in the system after her reported death. Not because someone forgot to remove her, because someone needed her records alive. Ethan turned sharply toward Martha. Lillian didn't disappear from the files by accident, did she? Martha's eyes filled instantly. Not panic. Grief. The kind someone carries too long. Naomi looked between them, confused now. Grandma! Martha reached for Naomi's hand but stopped halfway there. Walter lowered his head. Daniel quietly closed the laptop like he already understood something Ethan still could not fully face. Then Naomi noticed one more thing nobody else had. The yellow-striped folder was slightly open at the bottom. A photograph had slipped halfway out sometime during the conversation. She pulled it free slowly. The image showed a line of children boarding buses outside St. Helena Hospital at exactly 8:14 p.m., and standing beside one of those buses, holding a clipboard in his hand, was Charles Whitmore himself. Put the photograph down. Claire Bennett's voice cut across the conference room before Naomi could even fully lift the picture from the table. The sharpness in it startled everyone. Even Claire seemed to realize too late how frightened she sounded. Naomi froze with the photograph still halfway in her hands while Ethan turned slowly toward Claire. Emergency lights washed the room in pulses of red and white. Outside the glass walls, executives moved nervously through the dim hallways as alarms continued echoing through Whitmore Tower. Ethan stepped closer to Naomi immediately. Why? He asked quietly. Claire forced her expression back under control. Because those files involve protected minors and confidential medical records. From 14 years ago? Daniel snapped before he could stop himself. Claire's eyes flashed toward him hard enough to silence the room again. Naomi looked back down at the photograph. Children boarding buses. Charles Whitmore standing beside them with a clipboard. One little girl near the bus door wore a dark necklace shaped like a tiny blue teardrop. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the picture. That necklace again, she whispered. Martha inhaled sharply. Too sharply. Ethan heard it immediately. You know that necklace, he said. Martha shook her head too fast. No, but Naomi was already moving. Without asking permission, she carried the photograph toward the conference room windows where the stormlight fell stronger across the image. The girl holding the teddy bear, Naomi said softly. That's my mama. The room seemed to physically stop breathing. Ethan stepped beside her slowly. Lillian Brooks could not have been older than 10 in the picture. Thin braids, oversized sweater, one hand clutching a stuffed bear while the other touched the blue necklace at her throat. Suddenly the timeline shattered apart again. Lillian wasn't connected to the transfers because she worked there later. She had been one of the children moved out herself. Martha closed her eyes briefly like she had spent years fearing this exact moment. Walter lowered his head in shame. Claire stepped forward carefully. Naomi, sweetheart, you don't understand what you're looking at. Ethan's expression darkened instantly at the word sweetheart. Naomi didn't answer Claire. She kept staring at the photograph instead. Mama used to draw that necklace everywhere, she murmured. On grocery lists, birthday cards, even napkins. Ethan remembered the child's drawing clipped to the transfer file. The same necklace. The same careful blue crayon. Daniel suddenly looked back toward the laptop screen still glowing on the conference table. Ethan. His voice had changed again. Uneasy. He turned the monitor around slowly. An old St. Helena intake file filled the screen now. Patient designation. Lillian Brooks. Status. Transfer approved. Guardian authorization. Charles Whitmore. Ethan stared at the words without moving. Not sponsor. Not donor. Guardian. The meaning hit him before anyone said it aloud. Claire saw it happen in his face. "Ethan," she said carefully, "don't jump to conclusions." But the room had already crossed somewhere dangerous. Naomi looked up at Ethan with quiet confusion. "Why would your daddy sign papers for my mama?" No one answered immediately because suddenly every possible answer felt catastrophic. Then the conference room door handle jerked violently from the outside. Once, twice, harder the third time. Security voices echoed beyond the glass. "Mr. Whitmore, open the door immediately." Daniel looked toward Ethan in alarm. "That's not building security." Another violent slam rattled the door. Naomi instinctively backed closer to Ethan while Claire stared at the entrance with something close to panic breaking through her calm for the first time. Then a man's voice shouted through the glass loud enough for everyone inside to hear. "Federal investigators. Open this door now." The first thing Ethan Whitmore did after the federal agents entered the room was close the photograph folder himself. Not hide it, protect it. The movement was calm enough to confuse everyone watching him. Red emergency lights still pulsed faintly through the glass walls while agents spoke. Quietly with Daniel near the doorway, but Ethan had gone strangely silent. He stood beside the conference table staring out at the rain-covered skyline, one hand resting lightly on the closed folder containing Lillian Brooks' childhood photograph. Naomi noticed he kept tapping the same finger against the cardboard edge. Thinking, measuring, building something privately inside his head. Claire noticed it too. That worried her more than his anger had. "Ethan," she said carefully, "federal investigators arriving doesn't mean anyone here committed a crime." Ethan finally turned toward her. "You knew they were coming before we did." Not a question. Claire's face remained composed, but she didn't answer immediately. Another silence stretched across the room. Daniel glanced toward Ethan subtly, waiting for direction now instead of giving it. That alone told Naomi the balance had changed. Ethan moved toward the investigators at the door and quietly requested 10 minutes before formal questioning began. The lead agent hesitated, then agreed after recognizing him. As the agent stepped back into the hallway, Ethan locked the conference room door again. Different reason this time. Not fear. Time. Naomi watched him carefully. "You already know what you're gonna do," she whispered. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Not yet." But Naomi noticed he had already moved the yellow-striped transfer folder away from the others, separating it, prioritizing it. Another tiny thing adults thought children missed. Martha sat quietly near the windows, twisting her wedding ring around and around her finger, even though Naomi had never once heard her mention a husband. That detail tugged at Naomi immediately. "Grandma," she asked softly, "why do you still wear that ring if Grandpa's gone?" Martha froze, just for a second. Ethan caught it too. Walter lowered his eyes again like he wished he were somewhere else entirely. Before anyone answered, Naomi wandered slowly toward the shelves lining the conference room walls. Awards, architectural models, framed newspaper covers about Whitmore Holdings transforming Chicago neighborhoods. Then one object stopped her completely. Silver fountain pen displayed inside a glass case beneath a plaque that read, "Charles Whitmore, Groundbreaking Ceremony, St. Helena Redevelopment, October 2008. Naomi tilted her head. "That's the same pen," she murmured. Ethan frowned. "What pen?" She pointed carefully toward the silver clip. "The one from the contract signing." Ethan walked over slowly. She was right. Same scratch near the cap. Same dark blue ink stain at the seam. Suddenly the moment from 11 days ago felt different again. Claire had not chosen a random pen for Ethan to sign with. She had handed him his father's pen. A symbol, a repetition, a continuation. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Claire noticed immediately. "Charles liked tradition," she said softly. "People like rituals when power changes hands." But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. He was staring at the plaque date beneath the pen. October 2008. Same month as the transfers. Same month as the fake fire. Same month Lillian Brooks disappeared from official records. Naomi quietly touched the edge of the glass display. Your daddy wanted you to sign with it too, she whispered. Not accusation. Observation. Somehow worse. Ethan looked toward Claire again, but this time the anger in his eyes had changed shape. Sharper now. More patient. Then Daniel's laptop chimed softly from across the room. Nobody moved at first. Finally Daniel looked down at the incoming file and went completely still. Ethan, he said carefully, you need to see what was hidden inside Charles Whitmore's private archive. He turned the screen slowly around. On it sat a scanned birth certificate dated 8 years earlier. Child's name, Naomi Brooks. Father field, redacted.
Gardien signature, Charles Whitmore.
The redacted father field wasn't blank anymore. When Daniel enlarged the scanned birth certificate, faint impressions appeared beneath the black digital bar, like words buried under scratched paint. Naomi noticed it before anyone else. You can still see letters, she whispered, moving closer to the laptop screen. Ethan leaned beside her immediately. Under the harsh conference room lights, faint grooves pressed through the document became visible one by one. Ash. Martha suddenly stood up so fast her chair scraped sharply against the floor. Turn that off, she said, almost breathless. Everyone looked at her. Not because she sounded angry, because she sounded terrified. Ethan slowly turned toward her. You already knew whose name was under there. Martha shook her head too quickly, but Naomi was already studying the screen harder. That's your last name, she murmured softly to Ethan. Whitmore. The room seemed to narrow around the word. Claire stepped forward instantly. That proves nothing. Digital artifacts happen all the time. But her voice had lost its perfect balance now. Daniel looked at the metadata file attached to the scan. No, he said quietly. This isn't a copy artifact. Somebody manually redacted the father field 7 years after the original filing. Ethan's eyes lifted slowly toward Claire. Who had authorization? Daniel swallowed once before answering. Only family trustees and legal counsel. Claire. The implication landed without needing to be spoken aloud. Naomi stared at the birth certificate silently. She didn't fully understand corporate trustees or legal permissions, but she understood the feeling spreading through the room. Adults were no longer hiding behind certainty. The truth was pushing through cracks too fast now. Then Naomi noticed something else. Tiny blue handwriting near the bottom corner of the certificate, almost hidden beneath an official seal. She reached for the laptop before anyone stopped her and zoomed in carefully with 2 fingers. A handwritten note appeared beside the guardian's signature. Transfer deferred, necklace identifier confirmed. Ethan frowned immediately. What necklace? Naomi slowly reached beneath her sweater collar. Martha inhaled sharply. Too late. Naomi pulled out a tiny blue teardrop pendant hanging from a thin silver chain. The exact necklace from the old bus photograph. Silence hit harder than any alarm had. Ethan stared at the pendant like the room had vanished around it. Claire's face emptied completely for one terrifying second before control returned. Naomi, Martha whispered painfully. Why are you wearing that? Naomi looked confused. You gave it to me. Martha's eyes filled instantly. Ethan stepped closer without realizing it. The tiny pendant swung gently beneath the conference room lights. Deep blue glass wrapped in silver wire worn smooth with age. Not a drawing. Not a memory. Physical proof. Daniel quietly opened another archive image from the transfer files. Child Identification Protocol, Site B. Jewelry markers required for relocation verification. The same necklace appeared beside a typed inventory number. Ethan suddenly understood why Lillian had drawn it everywhere. Why Charles Whitmore's archives protected Naomi's records. Why the father field had been hidden years later instead of erased immediately. Naomi herself was connected to whatever happened at St. Helena more deeply than anyone had admitted. Claire moved suddenly toward the laptop. Too suddenly. Ethan caught her wrist before she reached the keyboard. Don't, he said quietly. Real fear flickered across Claire's face now. Not fear of scandal. Fear of exposure. Outside the conference room, Federal agents' voices echoed again through the hallway as more people entered the executive floor. The investigation was spreading fast. Naomi looked down at the pendant resting against her sweater. "Mama used to tell me never to take it off," she whispered. Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on the necklace. Then slowly, almost unwillingly, he looked back toward the birth certificate on the screen, toward the hidden Whitmore name beneath the redaction. And for the first time since this began, he asked the question he had been avoiding without realizing it. "Martha," his voice lowered carefully. Who exactly was Naomi's father? For a long moment, nobody answered Ethan Whitmore's question. Rain rolled slowly down the conference room windows while emergency lights pulsed red across the glass table like a heartbeat refusing to calm down. Naomi stood beside him with the blue pendant resting against her sweater, unaware that every adult in the room had suddenly become afraid of the same thing. Martha finally sat down very carefully, as if the truth itself had weight. "Naomi's father wasn't Charles Whitmore," she said quietly. Ethan felt a strange relief flicker through him before disappearing again. Because Martha wasn't finished. It was Daniel Reeves. Silence crashed through the room harder than any alarm had. Daniel looked like someone had punched the air from his lungs. "No," he whispered immediately. Not denial. Shock. Real shock. Ethan stared at him, trying to force the sentence into the story he thought he understood. It wouldn't fit. Daniel had worked for Whitmore Holdings for 12 years. Loyal, careful, invisible in the way good assistants became invisible. Naomi frowned at him with open confusion. "You know my mama?" Daniel looked at her like he had forgotten how to breathe. Then slowly, pieces began falling into place all at once. The way Daniel panicked when Naomi's records appeared. The midnight warnings. The fear in his voice every time Claire got closer to the transfer files. The reason he kept helping Ethan even after risking his career. Not loyalty to Whitmore Holdings. Protection. Martha wiped at her eyes roughly. "Lillian and Daniel were teenagers at St. Helena," she said softly. "The hospital used Brookside kids in relocation testing programs after the daycare transfers." Ethan's stomach turned cold. Testing programs? Walter nodded weakly from the corner. Behavioral tracking. Identity reassignment studies. Rich donors funding social outcome experiments. Naomi looked lost now, clutching the cassette player tighter against her chest. Ethan noticed immediately how small she suddenly seemed inside the enormous conference room. Martha's voice cracked. Lillian found out the children were being separated, renamed, monitored. She tried to expose it. Daniel lowered himself slowly into a chair, unable to look directly at Naomi yet. Claire discovered she had copied records before she could release them. Another shift, another truth turning upside down. Claire had never been protecting only a business scandal. She had spent 14 years burying evidence of children being erased from their own identities. Naomi touched the blue pendant unconsciously. "Mama hid the papers?" Martha nodded once. "Inside the necklace case." Ethan looked sharply toward the pendant again. The strange emphasis on the necklace suddenly made horrifying sense. Not sentimental. Storage. Naomi noticed everyone staring at it now. "What?" she whispered. Daniel stood abruptly. "The pendant opens." Martha's eyes widened. No, but Naomi had already started twisting the silver wire carefully beneath the blue glass. Tiny click. The teardrop pendant split open in her hands. Inside sat a tightly folded strip of yellowed paper no bigger than a fingernail. Claire moved instantly, faster than anyone expected. "Give me that." Ethan blocked her before she reached Naomi. For the first time since this began, Claire's composure shattered completely. "You don't understand what releasing those files will do," she snapped. People with money and power were involved. Senators, donors, judges. The room went still again. Bigger than Brookside. Bigger than Whitmore Holdings. Naomi carefully unfolded the tiny paper with trembling fingers. Rows of handwritten names filled the strip beneath faded hospital codes. Children. Numbers. Transfer locations. Then Ethan saw one final line written at the very bottom in Charles Whitmore's unmistakable handwriting. If anything happens to Lillian, trust no one inside the company. Before anyone could react, the conference room lights suddenly died again. Total darkness swallowed the room, and from somewhere just outside the locked door came the unmistakable sound of a key turning slowly from the other side. "Daniel, move away from the door." Ethan Whitmore's voice cut through the darkness before panic could fully take hold. The emergency lights were still dead. Only flashes of distant lightning spilled faint silver across the conference room windows. Another slow turn of the key echoed from outside. Someone had access to Ethan's private executive floor. Someone patient enough not to force the lock. Ethan moved immediately toward Naomi and Martha, guiding them behind the conference table with one arm while pulling his phone from his pocket with the other. "No signal. Dead." "The building network's blocked," Daniel muttered after checking his own device. Claire stood frozen near the wall, breathing harder now than she realized. Walter whispered quietly, "They never cut power unless retrieval teams are involved." Ethan's eyes snapped toward him. "Retrieval teams?" Before Walter could answer, Naomi tugged Ethan's sleeve sharply. "Wait." Her voice stayed low but urgent. She pointed toward the frosted glass beside the door where shadows shifted beneath the lightning flashes outside. "There's more than one person." Ethan narrowed his eyes. She was right. One shadow stood still near the lock while another moved farther back down the hallway. Watching. Coordinating. Ethan made a decision instantly. "Daniel, take Martha and Naomi through the archive passage." Claire looked up sharply at those words. Too sharply. Ethan caught it immediately. "There's no archive passage," she said fast. Walter stared at her in disbelief. "You told him it was sealed?" Another crack in the room. Ethan's expression hardened. "My father built emergency access corridors behind this floor after the 2003 fire." He grabbed a framed architectural blueprint from the wall and slid it sideways. A hidden panel clicked softly open beside the bookshelves. Cold air drifted from the darkness beyond. Naomi stared at the hidden corridor with wide eyes. "You knew about this the whole time?" Ethan shook his head once. "No. I just finally started paying attention to the things my father hid." Another hard metallic click sounded at the conference room door. Closer now. The lock was almost open. Daniel moved quickly toward the hidden passage, but Naomi suddenly stopped beside the conference table instead of following. Her eyes had fixed on the folded strip of paper from the pendant still lying near the laptop. "The names," she whispered. Ethan turned back instantly. "What?" Naomi grabbed the paper herself before anyone else could. "If they came for this, then the names matter more than me." Martha looked horrified. "Baby." But Naomi was already unfolding the fragile strip again beneath a flash of lightning. Her finger stopped halfway down the handwritten list. "This one," she said quietly. Ethan stepped beside her. One name had been circled faintly in blue ink different from Charles Whitmore's handwriting. Rebecca Valley. No transfer number beside it. No relocation code. Just a handwritten note underneath. Safe until board approval. Ethan frowned. Who's Rebecca Vale? Claire's face drained of color faster than before. Not fear this time. Recognition. Naomi noticed immediately. "You know her." Claire stayed silent. Outside the door, voices murmured low and controlled. Then the lock finally clicked open. Ethan shoved the folded name list into his jacket pocket and moved toward the hidden passage fast. Inside. Now. But before anyone crossed the threshold, the conference room lights suddenly flickered back on all at once. Bright. Blinding. And standing in the open doorway beyond the now unlocked door was not security, not federal agents, but a silver-haired woman in a navy coat holding an old hospital identification badge in her hand. She looked directly at Naomi first, then at Claire. And when she spoke, Claire actually stepped backward. "You should have burned every file when I told you to." Naomi recognized the woman before anyone else did. Not from memory exactly. From the drawing inside the transfer folder. The same sharp cheekbones. The same silver streak through dark hair. The woman standing in the conference room doorway looked older now, colder too, but Naomi felt the connection immediately. "You're Rebecca Vale," she whispered. The silver-haired woman's eyes shifted toward Naomi with visible surprise. Claire Bennett looked suddenly smaller beside her. Not weaker. Managed. "So the child still notices everything," Rebecca said quietly as she stepped inside and closed the conference room door behind her. Ethan felt the balance in the room tilt instantly. Claire had always been the center of the danger. Now it was obvious she had been answering to someone else. Rebecca removed her rain-soaked gloves one finger at a time while studying the people around the table. "Charles Whitmore should have destroyed the transfer records when he had the chance," she said calmly. "Instead he hid them and hoped guilt would become morality." Ethan stepped forward. "You ran St. Helena." Rebecca smiled faintly.
No.
"I designed it." Another shift. Bigger than before. Walter lowered his head completely now, unable to even look at her. Daniel instinctively moved closer to Naomi without realizing it. Rebecca noticed that too. "Interesting," she murmured. "You finally told him about the girl." Daniel's face tightened immediately. Naomi looked between them in confusion. "You knew about me?" Rebecca's gaze softened slightly for the first time. "Long before you were born." The room went silent again, but this silence carried something stranger beneath it. Not just fear. History. Rebecca slowly placed the old hospital identification badge onto the conference table. St. Helena Pediatric Behavioral Research Division. Ethan's stomach turned cold. Research. Not care. Not relocation. Research. Rebecca glanced toward the hidden passage behind the bookshelf without anyone mentioning it. Charles used that corridor to move files after the board turned against him. Ethan's eyes narrowed instantly. "You knew about the passage. I helped design this floor too." Claire looked trapped now in a way Ethan had never seen before. "Rebecca," she said quietly, "this was supposed to stay contained." Naomi noticed the wording immediately. Not hidden. Contained. Like the truth itself was dangerous to release. Rebecca ignored Claire completely and looked toward Naomi instead. "May I see the pendant?" Martha started to object, but Naomi had already stepped forward on instinct. Ethan almost stopped her. Almost. Rebecca held the tiny blue teardrop carefully in her palm beneath the harsh conference room lights. "Transfer markers," she murmured softly. "Charles hated them." Ethan frowned. "Then why did he authorize the program?" Rebecca looked at him for a very long time before answering. "Because your father thought he could control where it ended." Another assumption cracked apart. Charles Whitmore had not created the program. He had entered it believing he could manage it, and failed. Naomi noticed Rebecca's thumb rubbing nervously across the pendant edge. Not sentiment. Recognition. Then Naomi saw something else no adult caught. Tiny scratches carved into the silver wire around the pendant. Letters. "There's writing on it," she whispered. Rebecca's hand froze instantly. Ethan stepped closer. Inside the silver, wrapping, nearly invisible beneath years of wear, sat 4 engraved initials. RV Rebecca Vale closed her hand around the pendant too quickly. Too personally. Naomi looked up at her carefully. "That was yours first." Nobody breathed for a second. Daniel stared at Rebecca in disbelief. Claire looked genuinely alarmed now. Rebecca slowly opened her hand again, but the calmness she wore before had cracked at the edges. "Lillian stole it from my office the night she disappeared," she said quietly. Ethan felt another piece sliding violently into place. Not random theft. Not sentimental jewelry. Lillian Brooks had taken something from Rebecca Vale before vanishing from St. Helena Records. Then Rebecca looked directly at Ethan and said the one thing nobody in the room expected. "Your father didn't hide Naomi from me." Her eyes shifted slowly toward Claire. "He hid her from the board." The first gunshot wasn't aimed at anyone. It shattered the conference room window behind Ethan Whitmore and sent glass exploding across the floor in a storm of silver fragments. Naomi dropped instinctively beside the table as Martha screamed her name. Wind roared instantly into the room through the broken wall while downtown Chicago lights blurred beneath heavy rain 50 floors below. "Everybody down!" Daniel shouted, dragging Walter behind the conference table. Ethan grabbed Naomi with one arm and forced her beneath the heavy oak surface just as a second shot tore through the glass display holding Charles Whitmore's silver pen. The case exploded beside them. Rebecca Vale didn't duck immediately. She turned toward the shattered window with something colder than fear crossing her face. Recognition. They came faster than I thought, she whispered. Claire stared at her in disbelief. You said the board wouldn't move until morning. Another crack in the story. Ethan heard it clearly even through the alarms and wind. The board. Not police. Not investigators. Somebody bigger. Naomi pressed against the table edge, clutching the blue pendant and cassette player together against her chest. Then she noticed something nobody else did. The bullets weren't aimed at people. Every shot had targeted. The files. The display case. The laptop. Evidence. Mr. Whitmore, she whispered urgently, tugging his sleeve hard enough to pull his attention downward. They're trying to destroy the papers. Ethan looked toward the shredded glass around the conference room. She was right. Not one shot had come near the people hiding inside. Another blast shattered the overhead lights instead. Darkness swallowed half the room again while smoke alarms screamed louder. Rebecca moved suddenly toward the hidden passage behind the bookshelf. We have less than 2 minutes before they breach the executive floor. Ethan blocked her path instantly. Who are they? Rebecca looked at him carefully. The people your father stopped obeying. Another violent crack ripped through the room as a bullet slammed into the conference table inches from Daniel's hand. Martha covered Naomi protectively, but Naomi kept staring toward the ruined display case instead. The silver fountain pen had rolled free across the carpet. Beside it lay something nobody had seen before. A tiny brass key hidden inside the shattered display base. Naomi crawled toward it before Ethan noticed. Naomi, wait! But she already had the key in her hand. Small, old, marked with the same blue teardrop symbol engraved into her pendant. Rebecca saw it and went pale instantly. Charles hid it there? She whispered. Ethan looked sharply toward her. What does it open? Rebecca hesitated. Too long. A vault. Another shot slammed into the far wall. Closer now. The attackers were moving inward through the executive floor. Daniel looked toward the hidden passage desperately. We need to go. But Naomi was already turning the brass key over in her fingers. There's numbers on it. Ethan leaned closer beneath the table. 8-14B. The same numbers. The stopped clock. The bus departures, the transfer site. Nothing in this story had been random. Rebecca suddenly grabbed Ethan's arm hard enough to hurt. If they find that key before you reach the vault, everyone connected to Brookside disappears permanently. Ethan stared at her. What's inside? Rebecca's voice lowered almost to a whisper. The original transfer recordings. The room froze. Around the words. Not reports. Not paperwork. Recordings. Proof people could hear with their own ears. Naomi looked down at the cassette player in her lap at the exact same moment Ethan understood why her mother had hidden things inside music and jewelry instead of files. Then the conference room doors burst violently inward. Armed men flooded the hallway outside in black tactical jackets with no company markings at all. And standing calmly behind them beneath the flashing emergency lights was a face Ethan Whitmore recognized instantly from Whitmore Holdings board meetings.
Richard Hale.
Richard Hale wasn't leading the armed men. He was buying time for the person behind them. Naomi realized it first. While everyone else focused on Hale standing beneath the flashing emergency lights, Naomi noticed the tactical men kept glancing past him toward the elevator hallway like they were waiting for someone more important to arrive. He's not the boss, she whispered urgently to Ethan. Ethan's eyes narrowed instantly. Another assumption collapsed. Richard Hale had seemed untouchable for years inside Whitmore Holdings. But now even he looked tense. Controlled, yes. Powerful, yes. But not in charge. Hale stepped calmly into the ruined conference room while glass crunched beneath polished shoes. Ethan, he said almost sadly, you should have signed the papers 11 days ago. Armed men spread carefully through the hallway but never crossed the doorway fully. Not yet. They were containing the room. Rebecca Vale's expression hardened the moment Hale entered. You promised the children would stay protected.
Hale laughed softly.
Protected. His eyes drifted toward Naomi holding the brass key. Rebecca, the program only survived because the right children disappeared at the right time. Ethan felt cold fury rise through him. You moved children through Brookside for donors. Hale looked genuinely unimpressed by the accusation. No, Ethan. Your father moved them. I only continued what he started. Another twist of the knife. Another attempt to pull Charles Whitmore back into the center of the guilt. But Naomi suddenly shook her head. That's not true. The room paused.
Hale
Looked down at her with mild amusement. And why would you know that? Naomi pointed toward the tactical men outside. Because scared people look at doors. Hale's smile faded slightly. Naomi tightened her grip on the cassette player. Your men keep looking at the elevator instead of you. Ethan turned instantly toward the hallway. She was right again. The armed men weren't protecting Hale. They were waiting. Then the elevator bell chimed softly somewhere beyond the corridor. Every armed man straightened at once.
Hale stepped backward instinctively.
Not respect. Fear. The real power hadn't entered yet. The elevator doors opened slowly. A tall older man stepped out wearing a dark wool coat untouched by the rain outside. Silver hair. Thin black gloves. Calm eyes that moved across the ruined conference room like someone inspecting unfinished construction. Ethan's blood turned cold before his mind caught up. Charles Whitmore wasn't dead. Nobody breathed. Not Martha. Not Daniel. Not even Rebecca. The world seemed to physically tilt sideways around the revelation. Every assumption shattered at once. The hidden archives. The sealed birth certificate. The emergency corridors. The warnings written in his handwriting. Charles Whitmore had never been a dead man leaving clues behind. He had been alive the entire time, moving pieces from the shadows while everyone blamed ghosts and memories. Ethan stared at his father standing beneath the emergency lights like a man watching his own history rise from the grave. You! His voice failed completely. Charles looked older than Ethan remembered. Smaller too, but his eyes remained terrifyingly sharp. I tried to keep her hidden long enough, he said quietly, looking directly at Naomi. Not Ethan. Naomi. Hale shifted uneasily beside him. We don't have time for sentiment. Charles ignored him completely. The board found the vault sooner than I expected. Another crack. The vault. The recordings. None of this had been random discovery. Somebody had been delaying something inevitable for years. Naomi looked at Charles carefully, then at Ethan beside her. Same eyes. Same silence before speaking. The realization hit her before anyone else. You knew me before today, she whispered. Charles Whitmore's face broke for the first time since entering the room. Not guilt. Grief. Then armed footsteps thundered suddenly from the hallway behind the tactical team. Federal agents. Real ones this time. Hale spun toward the noise instantly. Charles Whitmore looked directly at Ethan and spoke fast for the first time. If the board gets the recordings before you do, Naomi disappears the same way her mother almost did. Then he pulled a second brass key from inside his coat. Same blue teardrop symbol. Same engraving. Vault 8-14B. Charles Whitmore placed the second brass key on the shattered conference table between himself and Ethan like a man laying down a loaded weapon. The room had gone strangely quiet despite the alarms still screaming through Whitmore Tower. Federal agents barked orders somewhere down the hallway. Armed men shifted nervously near the elevators. But inside the ruined conference room, everything narrowed to father and son standing across broken glass and 14 years of buried lies. Ethan stared at Charles without touching the key. You let me believe you were dead. Charles held his gaze calmly. Because the board needed to think I was. Hale stepped forward immediately. Charles, enough. Ethan noticed it instantly. Hale wasn't controlling Charles anymore. He was afraid of him speaking too long. Another balance shift. Another hidden layer turning visible. Charles ignored Hale completely. You think this story started with greed? He said quietly to Ethan. It didn't. It started with panic. Rain lashed violently through the shattered windows behind him, while emergency lights painted his face in flashes of red. Ethan felt anger rising again, but underneath it something worse had begun growing. Recognition. Same pauses before speaking. Same habit of studying silence before making decisions. Naomi watched both men carefully. Then she stepped forward before anyone expected it. "You keep looking at him instead of the bad guy," she said softly to Ethan. The sentence landed harder than shouting would have. Ethan blinked once. She was right. Hale had spent the last 10 minutes almost invisible while Ethan drowned in the shock of his father being alive. Hale smiled faintly like he understood exactly what Naomi had just interrupted. "Smart child," he murmured. Naomi frowned at him immediately. "You smile like people on TV asking for money." Daniel almost choked on a nervous breath beside her. Even Rebecca looked startled. But Ethan saw something else. Hale's right hand tightened slightly against his coat sleeve when Naomi spoke. Tiny movement. Defensive. Like she had accidentally stepped too close to something important. Ethan finally picked up the brass key. Cold metal. Same blue teardrop engraving. "What's in the vault?" he asked without looking away from Hale now. Hale answered before Charles could. "A disaster." Charles's eyes sharpened instantly. "A confession." Another shift. Same object. Completely different fear. Ethan realized suddenly that nobody in this room was fighting over money anymore. They were fighting over which version of history survived the night. Naomi slowly moved closer to the broken display case while the adult spoke. Her fingers brushed lightly across the shattered remains of Charles Whitmore's silver pen. Then she looked down at the cassette player still hanging from her shoulder. "Mama hid things inside music," she whispered quietly, mostly to herself. Ethan heard it anyway. So did Charles. And for the first time since revealing himself, something emotional cracked through Charles Whitmore's control. Grief. Real grief. Hale noticed it too. "You always had a weakness for the Brooks women," he said coldly. Ethan's eyes snapped toward him. Not random wording. Not accidental. Another clue hiding in plain sight. Naomi noticed it first again. "You knew my mama too." Hale looked at her carefully for a beat too long before smiling. Wrong move. Ethan saw it immediately. The board wasn't just protecting a program anymore. This had become personal years ago. Then federal agents finally reached the conference room doorway behind the armed men. Weapons raised. Tension snapped instantly tighter. Hale took one slow step backward toward the elevators. Charles Whitmore lowered his voice toward Ethan. "If Hale reaches the vault, before we do, every recording disappears forever." Ethan tightened his grip around the brass key. Naomi suddenly bent down beside the broken display case and picked up something tiny hidden beneath the shattered glass. Cassette tape, labeled only with one date written in faded blue ink. October 14th, 2008. Naomi looked up slowly. "I think," she whispered, "this is the night everybody's lying about." Naomi didn't wait for Ethan to answer. The moment she saw Hale's eyes lock onto the cassette tape in her hand, she ran. Small sneakers sliding across broken glass, braid whipping behind her, cassette player bouncing against her side, while alarms screamed through Whitmore Tower. "Naomi!" Ethan shouted instinctively, but she was already gone through the shattered conference room doorway before anyone could stop her. Every armed man turned at once. That was exactly what she wanted. Hale pointed immediately. "Get the tape!" The hallway exploded into motion. Federal agents surged forward shouting commands while Hale's tactical men pushed toward the elevators. In the chaos, nobody noticed Ethan slipping Charles Whitmore's brass key into his coat pocket. Naomi sprinted toward the executive archive corridor alone, clutching the cassette tape so tightly the plastic edges cut against her fingers. She didn't fully understand vaults or transfer programs or corporate boards, but she understood one thing clearly now. The adults were lying differently whenever that tape appeared. That meant the tape mattered more than the shouting. Behind her, footsteps thundered closer. Naomi glanced back once and nearly lost her balance. One of Hale's men was gaining fast. Too fast. She spotted the hidden archive passage door ahead and darted inside just before a hand nearly caught her sweater. The metal door slammed shut behind her. Darkness swallowed the narrow corridor immediately except for thin strips of emergency lighting near the floor. Naomi pressed herself against the wall, breathing hard. Somewhere deeper inside the building, old pipes rattled softly. Then she heard something strange beneath the alarms. Music. Faint jazz crackling through static. Her cassette player. Naomi frowned and looked down. The player had somehow switched on during the chase. Soft trumpet notes drifted through the dark corridor. Then a second sound emerged underneath the music. Voices. Recorded voices. Naomi froze completely. October 14th, 1998. A woman's voice. Lillian Brooks. Naomi knew it instantly even though she barely remembered her mother. She had heard that softness before in old voicemail recordings Martha sometimes replayed late at night. Naomi pressed stop immediately, terrified somebody outside might hear it. Too late. Footsteps halted outside the hidden passage door. Silence followed. Then one of Hale's men spoke quietly through the metal. "She's in there." Naomi covered her mouth to stop her breathing from making noise. Her fingers shook against the cassette player. Then she noticed something else. Beside the emergency light near the floor sat a tiny brass panel marked 8-14B. The vault. She stared at it in disbelief. Charles Whitmore had hidden the recordings inside the same corridor where Naomi accidentally fled. Not strategy. Luck. Or maybe something stranger than luck. Naomi pulled the brass key from Ethan's coat pocket memory inside her head. Same numbers. Same engraving. She looked down at the cassette tape again. Lillian's voice was still trapped inside it. Waiting. Outside the door, another metallic sound echoed sharply. Tools. They were trying to force the passage open. Naomi swallowed hard and crawled toward the brass panel alone. Her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the tape twice. Then she stopped suddenly. Another detail. Tiny scratches beneath the vault numbers. 2 arrows carved beside the lock. Left, right. Music symbols. Not security markings. Instructions. Naomi looked down slowly at her cassette player. Understanding flickered across her face. "Mama hid it in music," she whispered. Behind her, the hidden passage door groaned violently as metal bolts began tearing loose. Naomi slid the cassette tape into the player with shaking hands and turned the dial carefully left, then right, matching the scratched symbols beside the vault lock. For one terrible second, nothing happened. Then somewhere deep inside the wall, heavy gears began turning. The vault opened with the sound of something old finally giving up its secret. Inside the narrow steel compartment sat dozens of cassette tapes stacked beside sealed transfer ledgers, faded photographs, hospital intake cards, and a reel-to-reel recorder coated in dust. Naomi stared at the hidden archive while the jazz music from her cassette player continued crackling softly through the corridor. Every strange detail from the past 11 days suddenly stood connected in one impossible line. The blue hospital stickers, the erased names, the necklace markers, the stopped clock at 8:14, the transfer files, the fake daycare fire, Charles Whitmore's hidden corridors, and Lillian Brooks drawing the same blue pendant over and over because it had always been the key. Behind Naomi, the hidden passage door groaned violently again as Hale's men forced the lock further open. Metal screamed against metal. Naomi grabbed the nearest cassette tape without even checking the label and shoved it into her player. Static burst loudly through the corridor. Then a man's voice filled the darkness.
Richard Hale.
Younger, colder. Transfer group be cleared for reassignment. Naomi froze. More voices followed immediately. Doctors, administrators, names of children, numbers, instructions. The recordings were real, not rumors, not altered paperwork. Voices people could recognize forever. Footsteps thundered suddenly from the other side of the corridor. Ethan, Daniel, federal agents. Ethan reached Naomi just as the hidden passage door finally cracked inward behind them. "We found you," he breathed, dropping to one knee beside her. Naomi handed him the cassette player silently. Hale's recorded voice continued filling the narrow corridor, while federal agents listened in stunned silence. Children selected for behavioral integration must remain disconnected from original family structures. Another voice interrupted on the recording. Charles Whitmore, this goes too far. Ethan physically flinched hearing his father's voice buried inside the tapes. Not innocent, not clean, but fighting. Too late perhaps, but fighting. Naomi looked up at him quietly. He tried to stop it. Ethan couldn't answer, because now he heard the rest too clearly. Hail again. If you walk away now, Charles, the board releases every Brookside transfer publicly, and your company dies with it. Silence followed on the tape. Long enough to hurt. Then Charles's exhausted voice returned. Move the children somewhere safe first. Everything crashed together at once. Charles Whitmore had not built the program. He had become trapped inside it, then spent years hiding the surviving children from the same board he once obeyed. Hale had spent 14 years turning that compromise into a weapon. Federal agents immediately began seizing the tapes and ledgers from the vault while Daniel photographed everything with shaking hands. Rebecca Vale stood motionless near the corridor entrance, staring at the evidence like a woman finally watching a ghost step into daylight. Then Hale's voice echoed suddenly from deeper inside the building itself. Not the tape. Real. You still don't understand what you opened. Ethan turned sharply. Through the broken passage doorway, Hale stood surrounded by armed men and terrified executives forced against the walls of the executive floor. But Hale no longer looked desperate. He looked relieved. Those recordings don't destroy me, he said calmly. They destroy every politician, donor, judge, and foundation tied to St. Helena. Another layer. Bigger than Whitmore Holdings. Bigger than Brookside. Federal agents exchanged uneasy looks instantly. Hale saw it happen and smiled faintly. You think they'll release evidence that implicates half the people funding the city? Ethan stepped forward slowly. You're done. Hale shook his head almost sympathetically. No, Ethan. Now they have to choose whether the truth is worth collapsing everything attached to it. Naomi looked around at the frightened adults filling the corridor. Federal agents hesitating. Executives panicking. Even Rebecca afraid now. Then she noticed something nobody else saw. One final cassette tape still sitting untouched inside the vault. Different label. Different handwriting. Lillian Brooks, October 14, 2008, for Ethan only. Naomi slowly picked it up, and the moment Charles Whitmore saw the label in her hand, all the color disappeared from his face. Charles Whitmore crossed the corridor toward Naomi so quickly that federal agents almost drew their weapons. Don't play that tape, he said, and for the first time since revealing himself, his voice carried naked fear instead of control. Naomi looked up at him, clutching the cassette tightly against her sweater, while rain hammered the broken windows 50 floors behind them. Everyone stopped moving.
Hale.
Rebecca, Daniel. Even the agents holding evidence boxes froze as if the entire night had suddenly narrowed to the tiny tape in Naomi's hands. Ethan stared at his father in disbelief. You're afraid of one recording? Charles looked at him slowly, and something inside the older man finally collapsed. No, he whispered. I'm afraid of what it'll do to you. Silence hit harder than gunshots ever could. Naomi looked between them carefully. Same eyes. Same stubborn quiet before speaking. Then she did the one thing nobody else in the corridor was brave enough to do. She handed the cassette to Ethan. Not Charles. Ethan's fingers trembled slightly as he took it. The label stared back at him in faded blue ink. For Ethan only. Hale stepped forward instantly. You don't understand what Lillian was trying to protect. Ethan snapped toward him. Protect. Hale's calm finally cracked. If that tape becomes evidence, every surviving child from St. Helena gets dragged through the press, through courtrooms, through hearings. Their lives become headlines. Another shift. Not denial this time. Fear. Real fear. But not for children. For exposure. Naomi saw it clearly before anyone else. You don't care about them, she whispered softly. Hale looked at her. Naomi shook her head slowly. You care about people finding out you picked which kids mattered. The sentence landed like a blade. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. Daniel looked physically ill. Ethan finally slid the cassette into Naomi's player while Charles watched helplessly. The tape hissed softly before Lillian Brooks' voice filled the corridor. Older now. Tired. If Ethan Whitmore is hearing this, she said gently. Then Charles failed to keep the board away from Naomi. Ethan physically stopped breathing. Naomi stared down at the floor. Lillian continued. Charles is not Naomi's grandfather. Daniel is her father. But Charles protected her because the board believed Naomi carried the final transfer registry. Ethan looked sharply toward his father. Charles lowered his eyes without speaking. The tape crackled again. The registry was never inside the pendant, Lillian whispered. I hid it somewhere nobody powerful would ever think to look. Hale's face drained of color. Rebecca stepped backward slowly. Everyone in the corridor suddenly understood the same terrifying thing at once. After 14 years, the board still didn't know where the real registry was. Naomi frowned slightly. Mama never trusted rich people to look carefully, she murmured. Then her eyes lifted slowly toward the old cassette player in her hands. Ethan saw it immediately too. Every clue, every hidden message, the music, the scratched symbols, the recordings. Lillian had hidden the registry inside something ordinary enough for nobody powerful to value it. The cassette player itself. Hale lunged forward before anyone reacted. Take it! Armed men moved instantly, but federal agents finally stepped between them with weapons raised. Chaos erupted through the corridor. Shouting. Orders. Red emergency lights spinning across frightened faces. Yet in the middle of it all, Naomi stood perfectly still holding the cassette player against her chest, while Ethan moved protectively beside her without even thinking anymore. Charles Whitmore looked at his son then, not as a billionaire heir or corporate successor, but simply as a man about to choose what kind of person he would become after the truth. Ethan slowly turned toward the federal agents and held up the cassette player himself. No more hidden rooms, he said quietly. Hale stared at him in disbelief. Ethan's voice hardened. No more erased children. Then Naomi looked directly at Hale and asked the question nobody else in the building could survive hearing anymore. If we were supposed to disappear, she said softly, why are you still scared of us? The first arrest happened before the alarms even stopped. Federal agents moved Richard Hale against the corridor wall while cameras from emergency news crews began flooding the executive floor below. Hale didn't fight. That was the unsettling part. He simply watched Ethan Whitmore across the chaos with the exhausted expression of a man who knew one truth had finally escaped but others were still buried deeper. Around them, agents carried out evidence boxes filled with transfer tapes, hospital ledgers, and sealed Brookside files while executives from Whitmore Holdings stood pale and silent against the walls. The company Ethan inherited was changing shape in real time right in front of him. Naomi stayed close beside Martha near the hidden vault corridor, clutching the cassette player with both hands like it might still disappear if she loosened her grip. An agent approached carefully. Sweetheart, we'll need that recorder for evidence. Naomi looked at Ethan first before answering. Ethan noticed it immediately. Somewhere between the shattered conference room and the hidden vault, she had stopped looking at him like a stranger. He walked over slowly and knelt beside her. It's okay, he said softly. Naomi hesitated, then handed the cassette player over herself. Not because anyone forced her, because she chose to. The agent accepted it gently, but not before glancing uneasily toward the dozens of cameras now gathering downstairs. Everyone already understood the story would spread by morning. Another shift hit the corridor when federal agents approached Claire Bennett next. For the first time in 14 years, Claire looked truly tired. Not defeated exactly. Empty. You could have stopped this years ago, Ethan said quietly as agents waited beside her. Claire looked toward Naomi instead of him. No, she answered softly. Years ago I still believed control protected people. Then she held out her hands for the cuffs herself. Daniel stood motionless near the shattered windows while agents confirmed his statement about St. Helena and Brookside. Naomi watched him carefully. He still looked overwhelmed every time someone called him her father. Like the word itself hurt too much to hold. Yet, Martha finally walked toward him slowly through the broken glass. "She loved you," Martha whispered. Daniel's face cracked apart instantly. Not from guilt. From hearing something he had spent years fearing wasn't true anymore. Ethan turned away quietly, giving them space without announcing it. Another thing Naomi noticed. Outside, rain finally began easing over downtown Chicago. Sirens flashed blue and red across wet streets 50 floors below, while helicopters circled the tower roof overhead. For the first time all night, the city looked awake instead of asleep. Ethan stood alone beside the ruined conference room doorway, staring at workers carrying evidence cases through hallways his father once controlled completely. Charles Whitmore sat silently nearby under federal supervision, older now than Ethan had ever allowed himself to imagine. Not powerful anymore, just tired. Ethan walked toward him slowly. "You hid children inside your own company for 14 years, he said quietly. Charles nodded once, and still almost failed them. No defense. No excuse. Somehow that hurt worse. Naomi wandered carefully through the broken corridor until she stopped beside the shattered display case where Charles Whitmore's silver pen still lay among the glass fragments. The same pen Claire tried to make Ethan sign with 11 days earlier. Naomi picked it up gently. "This thing caused a lot of trouble," she murmured. Ethan let out the smallest laugh of the entire night before it faded again. Naomi looked up at him, then carefully held the pen out instead of keeping it. Ethan stared at it for a long moment before finally taking it from her hand. The gesture felt strangely bigger than the object itself, like something old was ending quietly without needing another speech. Then one of the federal agents approached Ethan with a sealed evidence folder. "Mr. Whitmore," he said carefully, "there's one final issue we need clarified before morning." Ethan frowned. "What issue?" The agent glanced briefly toward Naomi standing nearby beside Martha and Daniel, then back at Ethan. "According to the original St. Helena registry," he said quietly, "Naomi Brooks was never supposed to survive the transfer program at all. By 3:30 in the morning, Whitmore Tower had finally gone quiet. The helicopters were gone. The federal agents had moved the last evidence cases downstairs. Rainwater still clung to the shattered conference room windows, but the storm itself had passed sometime without Ethan noticing. He stood alone near the dark glass overlooking Chicago with Charles Whitmore's silver pen resting silently in his hand. The city beneath him looked smaller now. Not because the buildings changed, because for the first time in years, Ethan understood how little power had actually protected anyone. Somewhere down the hallway, workers swept broken glass into quiet piles. The soft scraping echoed faintly through the empty executive floor like the building itself was trying to clean away 14 years in one night. Ethan loosened his tie slowly and sat in the same leather chair where he almost signed the Brookside acquisition 11 days earlier. The realization hit differently now. If Naomi had not grabbed the pen from his hand, if she had not noticed the torn envelope corner, the wrong photograph, the hidden scratches on the necklace, every erased child would have stayed erased forever beneath polished speeches and million-dollar contracts. An 8-year-old girl had walked into the most powerful room in his company and simply refused to ignore what felt wrong. Ethan lowered his head briefly, not from exhaustion, from shame. He had spent most of his life believing intelligence meant moving faster than everyone else in the room. Naomi changed that without trying. She listened longer, watched smaller things, paid attention when people became uncomfortable. Somewhere along the way, Ethan realized he had inherited more than his father's company. He had inherited his blindness too. Soft footsteps crossed the hallway behind him. Ethan looked up quietly. Naomi stood near the broken doorway wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt one of the agents found downstairs for her after the storm. Her braids looked slightly uneven now from the long night. She carried 2 paper cups of hot chocolate carefully balanced in both hands. "The vending machine only had this left," she whispered, like the empty building might still be sleeping. Ethan accepted one of the cups slowly. The warmth surprised him. Naomi climbed into the chair beside him without asking permission. Neither of them spoke for a while. Steam drifted upward between them while the first pale hints of sunrise touched the edge of the skyline beyond the shattered glass. Ethan noticed Naomi watching the cleanup crews quietly below. "You tired?" he asked finally. Naomi nodded once. Then after a moment, "Grandma says people tell the truth slower when they're tired." Ethan let out another small laugh before it faded into silence again. He looked down at the silver pen still resting across his palm. Same pen, different weight now. Naomi noticed it too. "You don't gotta keep it if you don't want to," she said softly. Ethan turned the pen over once between his fingers. For years he had treated objects like symbols of success. Awards, contracts, buildings with his family name carved into marble. But tonight the only thing that mattered was a child sitting beside him drinking vending machine hot chocolate while the truth finally breathed somewhere outside hidden vaults and locked corridors. Ethan stood slowly and walked toward the shattered display case near the conference room wall. He looked at the empty space where the pen had once been honored behind glass. Then, without ceremony, he set the silver pen down inside one of the evidence boxes waiting for federal transport. Naomi watched him quietly from across the room. Ethan turned back toward her after a long moment. Something in his face had changed now that the noise was finally gone. Not victory, not relief, choice. Then he walked back over, sat beside her again, and asked the question that mattered more to him than the company waiting downstairs. "Naomi," he said softly, "what would make you feel safe enough to stay?" At 7:15 that morning, Ethan Whitmore walked into the Whitmore Holdings boardroom carrying a cardboard archive box instead of a briefcase. The long walnut table where billion-dollar acquisitions were usually approved sat crowded with exhausted attorneys, federal observers, and board members who suddenly looked much older than they had 12 hours earlier. Richard Hale's empty chair remained at the far end beneath the company seal. Ethan crossed the room without speaking and placed the archive box directly in front of it. Inside sat the remaining St. Helena transfer files, the blue hospital stickers still visible along the edges. Then, calmly, Ethan removed the gold-plated nameplate reading Ethan Whitmore, executive chairman, from the head seat and set it inside the box too. Silence spread across the room instantly. Daniel looked up sharply from across the table. Several board members exchanged confused glances. Ethan loosened his cuffs slowly. "Effective immediately," he said quietly, "Whitmore Holdings will dissolve every sealed redevelopment agreement connected to Brookside and open all internal archives to federal review." One board member started protesting immediately about investors, liabilities, public collapse. Ethan didn't even look at him. "And if this company survives by hiding children," he said, "then it deserves to collapse." Another shift. Final this time. Not strategy. Choice. He pushed the archive box toward the center of the table like a man returning something poisoned to the people who built it. Then he walked away from the head chair entirely and moved toward the windows instead. Down on the street below, reporters crowded behind barricades, while early morning commuters stopped to stare at the tower that had once looked untouchable. Ethan suddenly realized he did not care what the headlines would call him by noon. Behind him, Daniel spoke quietly for the first time. "If you step away now, they'll never let you back into this industry." Ethan looked out at the waking city for a long moment before answering. "I know. No anger. No regret. Just truth." A soft knock interrupted the room before anyone else could speak. Martha stepped hesitantly into the doorway with Naomi beside her wearing the same oversized gray sweatshirt from the night before. Naomi held a brown paper bag carefully against her chest. Several board members shifted uncomfortably seeing a child enter the room where so much damage had finally surfaced. Ethan noticed Naomi immediately scanning the room the way she always did, paying attention to details adults ignored. Her eyes landed on the empty chairman's chair first, then on the missing nameplate inside the archive box. "You gave it back," she whispered. Ethan nodded once. Naomi walked slowly toward him while Martha remained near the doorway. She opened the brown paper bag carefully and pulled out something wrapped in napkins. A blueberry muffin slightly crushed on one side. Ethan blinked in surprise. "The cafe downstairs was closing," Naomi explained softly. "You forgot to eat yesterday." The sentence hit harder than the board resignations or federal subpoenas ever could. Ethan accepted the muffin slowly with both hands like it mattered far more than breakfast. Naomi smiled faintly seeing him hold it that carefully. Then she pointed toward the conference table behind him. That room feels less cold now. Ethan glanced back at the boardroom. Same polished walls. Same skyline. But she was right. Something poisonous had finally left it. Naomi quietly reached into her sweatshirt pocket and pulled out one last thing. The torn corner of the original Brookside relocation envelope from 11 days earlier. The one she noticed before anyone else. She placed it gently on the table beside Ethan's untouched coffee cup. Circle closing quietly all at once. Ethan looked down at the crumpled paper for a long moment. Then he set the blueberry muffin beside it, picked up his coat, and turned toward Martha and Naomi instead of the board waiting behind him. "Come on," he said softly. "There's somewhere else I want to take you before the city wakes up completely." 3 weeks later, Naomi sat cross-legged on the floor of a small neighborhood grocery store, counting oranges into uneven stacks, while soft jazz crackled from the repaired cassette player beside her. Morning sunlight spilled through the front windows in warm golden strips, catching dust in the air above the shelves. The handwritten sign near the register still leaned slightly crooked because Ethan had hammered one side too high the night before and refused to let anyone fix it. Naomi liked that part. It made the store feel lived in instead of polished. Outside, Chicago buses hissed quietly along rain-clean streets, while customers wandered in carrying newspapers filled with headlines about Whitmore Holdings investigations and sealed St. Helena hearings still unfolding downtown. But inside the little grocery store on Brookside Avenue, nobody talked much about billionaires anymore. They talked about peaches being too expensive and whether the Cubs finally had a decent bullpen this season. Ethan stood near the coffee machine in rolled-up sleeves, helping an older man carry bottled water to his car. 3 months earlier, he would have delegated something like that without thinking. Now he just grabbed the case himself before the man could struggle. Naomi watched him through the fruit display quietly. Different posture, different eyes, less hurry inside him. Daniel noticed it too from behind the counter where he balanced invoices with one hand while talking softly with Martha about school enrollment forms for Naomi. The forms still sat unsigned. Not because anyone was uncertain about caring for Naomi, because everyone was finally trying to let her choose things for herself. Ethan came back inside carrying cold morning air with him. "You're stacking them by size again," he said to Naomi, nodding toward the oranges. Naomi shrugged. "People pick prettier fruit first." Ethan crouched beside her and switched 2 oranges around carefully. "Not always." Naomi looked at him sideways. "You saying ugly oranges deserve chances too?" Ethan smiled before he could stop himself. "Something like that." The bell above the shop door rang softly. A woman entered carrying a cardboard donation box for families displaced during the Brookside investigations. Ethan moved immediately to help her without asking questions first. Naomi noticed that too. The old Ethan Whitmore would have wanted names, contracts, explanations. This Ethan just carried heavy things when someone needed help. She reached into her pocket absent-mindedly and touched the tiny blue pendant still hanging around her neck beneath her sweater. She wore it differently now. Not like evidence. Like memory. The cassette player crackled softly beside her again. Same jazz song from the hidden corridor the night everything changed. Naomi picked up one orange and rolled it slowly between her palms. "Mr. Whitmore?" Ethan looked over from the counter while helping the woman unpack canned goods. "Yeah." Naomi hesitated just long enough to make him listen carefully. "You know that day I grabbed your pen?" Ethan leaned against the counter slightly. "Hard to forget." Naomi nodded thoughtfully. "I didn't do it because I was brave." Ethan frowned softly. "No." She shook her head. "I just thought you looked sad before you signed." The grocery store went quiet around the sentence. Not awkward quiet. The kind that settles softly into people when truth arrives without trying to sound important. Ethan looked at her for a long moment across the stacked oranges and half-unpacked donation boxes. Then slowly, without embarrassment or pride, he walked over and sat cross-legged on the floor beside her in his expensive slacks while customers moved quietly around them. Naomi handed him one of the oranges without looking up. Ethan accepted it carefully in both hands like something fragile. Outside, morning sunlight spread wider across Brookside Avenue, while the little bell above the grocery store door rang again and again as people kept coming inside.